Where is my president?
In little more than 10 days, the Republic of Afghanistan collapsed and the Taliban seized power. In the entire country, only one province, the province of Panjshir, today the focus of a budding resistance, managed to avoid the avalanche. The Taliban advance was so swift that, as we could all see live and direct, they managed to put the very American forces that had the mission of commanding the evacuation against the wall. At times, it was total chaos. After 20 years, thousands and thousands of lost lives, and a cost of over $2.2 trillion, according to estimates from Brown University, the dramatic images of the US withdrawal from Saigon were being repeated, though on this occasion to a much greater extent. How could this happen? How could the Taliban seize power so quickly?
American troops cannot and should not be fighting in a war and dying in a war that Afghan troops are not willing to fight for themselves. Joe Biden, President of the United States. President Biden lied and must be ashamed. We lost 70,000 men in war. We have carried out 95% of all operations since 2014. Just when we were clearing Farah, the air support, supply chain, and our communication were suspended. Sarfaraz, Afghan commando. They tied our hands behind our backs and sold the homeland. Damn Ghani and his gang. We will liberate Afghanistan from these terrorists. History will judge Ghani, the lover of their gang. General Bismillah Mohammadi, Minister of Defense of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan.
Afghan security forces were supposed to be ready. After 20 years of training and preparation by international troops, after US spending of more than $80 billion, and with supposedly 350,000 units between the army and militarized police, the Republic of Afghanistan was supposed to resist. At least, that's the story we were told.
23rd July 2018. We are on the right track. The Afghan military and police are demonstrating their will to succeed. John W. Nicholson Jr., four-star general and commander-in-chief of U.S. forces in Afghanistan from 2016 to 2018. We provided our Afghan partners with all the tools, let me emphasize, all the tools, training, and equipment of any modern military. We provided advanced weaponry. Joe Biden.
But what happened to an army that, since 2014, has been responsible for more than 95% of military operations to suddenly dissolve like a mere sugar cube? What happened in Afghanistan so the Taliban was able to seize power again with so little resistance? Why on earth did Afghanistan fall? On VisualPolitik, we have prepared a trilogy of videos to try to understand this whole story. The past, present, and future of the United States' longest war, of the latest military defeat of the great American power. Losing a war is never joyful, but no one imagined seeing the images of defeat, flight, and lack of order that we have all witnessed. Images that will forever be a heavy burden of neglect, defeat, and mismanagement for Joe Biden's administration.
There was nothing that I or anyone else saw that indicated the collapse of this government in 11 days. General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States.
In this first video, we're going to focus on the 4 key factors, the 4 hypotheses that explain the overwhelming Taliban victory. There are 4 scenarios that have occurred and that are complementary to each other. What we do not know with certainty is the exact weight that each of them has had in the Afghan debacle, but we do know that all of them have contributed decisively to what has happened.
We were betrayed. We were told a peace agreement is reached. A transitional government is being formed. Stop fighting. Retreat to your bases. Then we were ordered to hand over everything to the Taliban. I will write more as I am able to. Remember, another 9/11 is coming. I'm devastated. Sarfaraz, Afghan commando.
This is how Afghanistan fell. Listen up.
The betrayal of Doha.
Imagine you are the President of the United States, and after 20 years of combat, thousands upon thousands of casualties, and formidable expense, you are bogged down in a war you know you can never win. Or rather, that the cost and sacrifice of trying to win is too high.
I remember Afghanistan as a dusty beige nightmare of a place full of proud, brave people who did not want us there. Laura Jadid, journalist and US veteran of the Afghan War.
Imagine that at that precise moment, you are presented with a plan. Mr. President, we have the formula to escape the hornet's nest. We have a plan to avoid new casualties, to stop the economic drain that war entails, to prevent new terrorist groups from running wild, and at the same time, to possibly achieve some geo-economic gains. Sounds good, doesn't it? Well, now imagine that this plan consists specifically of making a pact with the Taliban and even facilitating their access to power. Yes, that's what I said.
There's ongoing talks with the Taliban.
and hopefully those will be successful.
We don't know if events unfolded according to this particular script, but that is in practice exactly what happened. In 2018, the Trump administration asked Pakistan to release Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, and US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo traveled and met with him to begin negotiations.
I met with Mullah Baradar in Doha.
Baradar is the current political leader of the Taliban. The result was that in February 2020, the Doha Agreement was signed, an agreement that the Afghan government of Ghani strongly opposed, although ultimately to no avail. The agreement established a timetable for the withdrawal of international troops, the release of thousands and thousands of Taliban prisoners, and the reduction of airstrikes, and also of US military operations. All this in exchange for the Taliban not attacking international troops, undertaking not to harbour terrorist groups, and negotiating a political solution to the conflict with the Afghan government.
We agreed to the release of over 5,500 Taliban prisoners, most of them guilty of serious crimes against humanity. We've paid a heavy cost for peace and taken serious risks, but we've seen, unfortunately, no dividends yet.
These are the details that are known, because much of the agreement remains and will remain secret. In other words, the Americans negotiated the roadmap for the future of Afghanistan not with the Afghan government, which was not even present at the table, but with the Taliban.
The Doha Agreement bought the Taliban a one-year reprieve. They were able to regroup, to plan, to strengthen their supply lines, to have freedom of movement without fear of US bombing. Andrew Watkins, member of the US Institute of Peace.
And in a way, it makes sense. Think about it. Beyond the moral question it raises, if you make a pact with the Taliban and make sure that they do not give shelter to terrorist groups that could attack, then it's the icing on the cake. You won't have any more casualties. You'll be able to leave the country without Al-Qaeda or any other group having free reign. You'll be able to focus your attention and resources on your real priority, the Pacific and the containment of China. And if on top of that they come to power, then it could even open the door to certain opportunities. Let me explain. Afghanistan is a country very rich in the minerals most coveted by the technology industry. Minerals such as copper, lithium, cobalt, niobium, rare earths, as well as gold and uranium. In fact, according to a Pentagon report cited by the New York Times in 2010, Afghanistan has the potential to become the Saudi Arabia of lithium. And not only that, there are also projects such as the Tapi gas pipeline, a 1,127-mile, that's 1,814 kilometers pipeline project that could carry natural gas from Turkmenistan to Pakistan, India, and China. A project that is owned by US oil company Chevron and that could alleviate China's dependence on Russian natural gas while reducing Iran's strategic importance. Well, in February 2021, in a visit apparently coordinated by the United States itself, the Taliban visited Turkmenistan and pledged to protect this project, because the pipeline has to pass through Afghanistan. And the problem so far is that in order to exploit minerals or build energy networks, you need political stability. As long as you are on a war footing with the Taliban, nothing can be done. But the Doha Agreement was an opportunity to leave once and for all, a CIA-style operation. And that, for many analysts, is what explains why the United States would practically stop attacking the Taliban, despite the fact that they have stepped up their operations against the Afghan army and institutions, to the point that the UN described 2020 as the most violent year in the country since records began. Sure, at first glance, the Doha agreements may explain the overall scenario, but it's not enough to fully understand why on earth the Afghan army dissolved so quickly. It's something that even caught the US government itself completely off guard. Although the truth is that the almost total reduction of airstrikes, the withdrawal of Air Force contractors, and the consequent demoralization of the troops played a key role. Listen up.
Looting as the norm.
It is not the first time that there has been a disbandment of the Made in the USA Afghan army. In the fall of 2015 in Kunduz province, an offensive by 500 Taliban defeated 3,000 Afghan soldiers and police and captured a provincial capital for the first time. Then in Helmand province, some 1,800 Taliban defeated nearly 4,500 soldiers and police.
They ran. They had everything they needed. Troops, weapons, ammunition, and they gave up. Omar Jan, commander of the Afghan army.
An important note, let us make no mistake. This is not to say that the Afghan army has not made efforts. Over the years, the Afghans have borne the brunt of the conflict. The army and police alone have accumulated around 70,000 casualties. The fact is that both demotivation and shortage of materials were the order of the day. But how can an army in which so much money has been invested, more than $80 billion in almost 15 years, have so many problems? Well, one reason lies in the kind of military the United States has designed. An army assembled in its own image and likeness, deployed throughout the country by means of a remote network of outposts and bases. A network completely dependent on a complex logistical and support system made up of planes and helicopters that the Afghans were simply incapable of managing.
When Kunduz province fell to the Taliban, many soldiers were killed. We were surrounded, there was no air support. In the last minutes, our commander told us that there was nothing they could do for us and that it was better to flee. They all abandoned the war and escaped. Abdul Qudus, 29-year-old Afghan soldier.
But above all, it has to do with what is perhaps the most striking Afghan characteristic of recent decades: massive corruption. And you see, despite the enormous amounts of money spent by the Americans, Afghan soldiers had derisory salaries. They could go months without being paid, and even ammunition was scarce. So when the Taliban showed up, they would pull a Pablo Escobar, plata o plomo, silver or lead. Either they surrendered and received supplies and even women and some money, or they would all be killed. In fact, it is believed that the Taliban have been cutting deals with military officials for many months now.
No region fell as a result of war, but as a result of psychological warfare. Abbas Tawakkoli, commander of the 217th Afghan Army Corps. Everyone just handed in their weapons and fled. We didn't get any help from the central government, so the district fell without any fighting. Rahimullah, a 25-year-old Afghan soldier.
The point is that supplies were scarce because probably a good part of the money spent by the Americans ended up in places like Dubai or Qatar. For example, Ahmed Zia Massoud, a former Afghan vice president, was accused of taking more than $50 million to Dubai, where he lived in a luxurious mansion and drove around in Rolls Royces. Another example? Well, check it out. Top military and government officials lied about the numbers of soldiers and pocketed the money from the phantom payroll. One day, the Americans who were funding the payroll of over 300,000 realized that the real number was barely more than 250,000, if that. And of the legitimate paychecks, many high commanders and warlords usually kept a good part of it, making the soldiers even more miserable. In the end, they had to set up an electronic payment system, and still the problems persisted. But it wasn't just a question of those at the top. Not at all. Corruption was widespread. After all, if you gave a soldier who is paid barely $200 a month, when he is paid, that is, equipment worth thousands of dollars, the result is, no wonder, the black market. That's exactly what happened when the Pentagon tried to equip the Afghan army with night vision goggles. They kept disappearing. And so did vehicle components, and so did weapons, so did ammunition, so did fuel, so did many supplies. All in all, the Americans were paying the bills, and control was conspicuous by its absence. In addition, soldiers and policemen were, in many cases, dedicated to collecting bribes at checkpoints, causing a large part of society to have little confidence in them for being soft. The police became the most hated institution in the country, because the Taliban did the same thing, but only once, not like the police who constantly demanded payments.
The Taliban principle is, once you pay the tax, bribe, they give you a receipt that works all over the country, and you will not be asked to pay the tax, bribe, again. Police officers, on the other hand, do not issue receipts for the bribes they extort. Ahmad Saeed Azimian, deputy head of the Chamber of Commerce in Herat province.
So if you have an army that is largely poorly trained, poorly equipped, lacking in everything, and unmotivated, the result is exactly what we have seen. When the Taliban arrived and threatened them, many forces fled or changed sides, handing over their US-made military equipment to the Taliban. A phenomenon that only worsened when they no longer had the support of the Americans. If they weren't fighting for a cause and everything around them was corrupt, why risk their lives? This factor, my friends, decimated the Afghan forces to levels that were actually far below the 167,000 troops the army was supposed to have. Some sources suggest that, at the moment of truth, there were barely 50,000 ill-equipped soldiers ready to fight, but scattered around the country without any strategy. The outcome is one we all know by now. But there are still two other hypotheses, two factors that we have to consider. Listen up.
Fatal errors and Pakistan.
It's clear that the United States has made many mistakes in Afghanistan. Perhaps the most significant of all has been the failure to create an army and security forces capable of defeating the Taliban. And here many analysts point to a very specific issue: the time it took to assemble an Afghan army. Because setting up an army and a police force from scratch is not at all easy, and doing it in Afghanistan. And on top of that, suffering a high personnel rotation due to the casualties suffered makes everything much more complicated.
We don't have to teach American soldiers to obey the law, not to take bribes, to respect human rights. They come into our force having internalized those things already. We try to create militaries in our image, and that's often not congruent with the political and social circumstances in which those forces are operating. Michael Nagata, former commander of U.S. Special Operations Command Central.
The fact is that when the United States invaded the country and defeated the Taliban, for a few years there was a certain calm. But obsessed with Iraq and with reducing committed spending, President Bush and his Defense Secretary, Donald Rumsfeld, made what have come to be seen as two big mistakes. Firstly, they rejected the offer of many Taliban leaders to negotiate a political solution. And secondly, they insisted that Afghanistan maintained ridiculous security forces, barely 50,000 men to control a huge country. In addition, the Pentagon wanted to reduce costs, so they insisted on keeping salaries and any expenses derived from the maintenance of the troops low. When Rumsfeld left in 2006 and the Taliban intensified their offensives, barely 26,000 Afghan soldiers had been trained and equipped. The decision turned out to be very costly because the Afghan army's shortcomings had to be covered for all these years by American troops, whose deployment costs exceeded $1 million per unit per year. The worst thing is that the Afghan army never managed to consolidate and consider that a modern army is not much more than a soldier carrying a weapon. For example, it lacks mechanics of all kinds, quartermasters, and medical professionals, and there is none of that in Afghanistan. Basically, the Bush and Rumsfeld decisions were a waste of the best years, while fueling the corruption we have already mentioned. And finally, there is the Pakistan theory. You see, many Afghans and analysts believed that the Pakistani army has trained, equipped, provided logistics, and even loaned officers, consultants, and troops to the Taliban. In other words, the Afghan army has actually faced a force that was largely trained by a much larger and more professional army. But why would Pakistan support the Taliban? Well, mainly to control Afghanistan and to avoid Indian influence. In addition, there is also the issue of the Tapi pipeline that could one day supply the country with gas. Well, these are the four factors that we have to take into account in order to understand the rapid fall of Afghanistan. All in all, the images we have seen are a huge stain on the management of the Biden administration. The chaos, the tension, the lack of coordination, the disaster. The Taliban have even had within their reach the possibility of turning 2,500 American soldiers into hostages. All they would have to do is to attack the runway and prevent planes from taking off and landing. If they have not done so, it is perhaps because they want government more than war. So what can we expect from the Taliban now? What future does Afghanistan face? Will the resistance be able to make life impossible for the Taliban? That is something that we'll be delving into in 2 upcoming videos here on VisualPolitik. So don't forget to subscribe, and now if you found this video interesting, then please give it a like. And once again, thank you very much for being there. All the best, and see you next time.
And if you want to learn more about politics and hear even more of my lovely voice, you can join us at Reconsider Media. We have a podcast at reconsidermedia.com/podcast. See you there.